paleontologist doing here? Doesn't make any sense.
I dragged him.
In one sense. I'm going to tell you a very little bit about my story because it is relevant to what I'm talking about. Here's my view of science. Science is just a very practical way of knowing something. There's nothing particularly dramatic or strange or anything else. It's what we do all the time. It's more a question of standards and proofs and using as much relevant data as you possibly can. It's also about facing up to when you are wrong, when the data are going in another direction. The first question you ask is, so what did I do to screw this up? Was I looking in the wrong places? Was I collecting the wrong kinds of information? And the beautiful part of science, at least from one perspective, is that it's self-correcting. When things go off the rails, it doesn't take long for some skinny graduate student to say that major professor just got it wrong, and I'm going to publish a paper and absolutely trash his ideas, and go on the cycle myself so that one of these days I occupy his chair. It's very self-serving in the end. But here's the point. What I'm going to talk about now, I'm going to try my damnedest not to make it overly technical, because that's not the point. I want the facts that are the really germane points to rise to the surface, and that's what's worth commenting about. Yes, there's a lot of lab-oriented work that has to go into that, and if any of you could possibly be interested in asking questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. But it's not the point. The process is not the point. It's the end result, what the end results may mean, and what they mean in light of other kinds of data that are all pointing in similar directions. Okay, so how did I get started at all in this kind of thing? Well, I'm interested in the evolution of mammals. I'm particularly interested in what's called the Quaternary, which is the last 2.6 million years. It's a geological epoch. And what happened? And one of the things that happened was a large proportion of the largest beasts, mostly mammals, but also a number of large birds and a certain number of larger reptiles, disappeared. And they disappeared all over the planet at different times, in different places within that time period. And for much of my career, we've been engaged in trying to sort out what happened. What were the causes? Was it always the same cause? Was it a variety of causes? Was it a conflation of causes? This kind of thing was something I found very interesting. Horses were one of the big mammals that disappeared in North and South America. We thought at the time the last of them survived up to about 10,000 years ago, which is the same time limit that was assumed to also be the case for the big proboscideans like mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed cats, the ground sloths. You've heard about some of these guys. There were dozens of others, and they disappeared. Now, when you do paleontology, one of the things you're very concerned about is getting it right about species. You want to know whether this species that you knew from one locality is the same as this species that you found at another locality, or if different, you want to describe the differences, and you want to, perhaps in some circumstances, try to address the question why they differ. What was the evolutionary thing going on here? So it never occurred to me that anybody could argue that Equus caballus was anything other than a native North American species, because its fossil record, the earliest evidence we have of this particular group, is exclusively North American, in the Pliocene, which is in this case about 4.5 to 5 million years old. And from that point, having arisen in North America, horses went elsewhere. They crossed the land bridge over the Bering Strait to get into Eurasia. They went down into Africa. They became zebras and donkeys and all the rest of it, different parts of this radiation. And it just never occurred to me when I'm looking at fossils from North America from the last several thousand years that you'd conclude that what I was looking at was a different species from the horse that lives today, the domestic horse, the one that's familiar to you. And in going into literature, I was just astounded at the kinds of characters that were being used to differentiate fossils found in North and South America from Equus caudalis. Because one of the things that is so true about all natural species is that they are variable. The individuals composing them are variable. And without that variability, it's a death sentence. Because if you don't have it and conditions change, you're going to be one of the losers. You need the variability for evolutionary forces to work on. Okay, I don't need to lecture all about modern equids. There's 8 of them. They're a very tightly packed group from a previous history where horses evolved rapidly and diversified rapidly in different parts of the world that they got to. That diversity tended to collapse at the beginning of the Quaternary, or by the beginning of the Quaternary. So we're left now with one genus, which is Equus, and 3 major groups: the asses, the zebras and their relatives, and the domestic horse. Now, as I was saying, for North America, in the Pleistocene, particularly the last part of the Pleistocene, sorry, I wasn't going to do this, but here I've already done it, introduce a new word. The Pleistocene is the larger part of the Quaternary, 2.6 up to about 11,000 years ago. So, in the late Pleistocene, which would be after 120,000 years ago, people like me, mammalian paleontologists, would find lots of horse fossils. And because when you name a fossil, your name gets attached to the species name, we're all in the game of naming species so that, in a sense, we live forever. It's like being an author. Now, there's nothing objectionable about that, because that's why we know the character of diversity over the geological epochs. It's because people have been very interested in sorting out what the compositions of those faunas and floras, for that matter, was. But, you know, it was like scientists gone wild when it came to horse taxonomy for the Pleistocene. I said that there were 8 species left, right, in genus Equus. There's 52 named species of Pleistocene horses from North America. Here you see some of them. Now, without going into technicalities, that's a lot of different horses. How could they possibly have radiated to that scale in such a short period of time? There's just something wrong conceptually about it. That's not an argument anymore, people realize that. But it still persists, the idea that in late Pleistocene North America there were a lot of different horse species, and you couldn't possibly say any one of them was ancestral to the horses that we know today. Let me show you why, or what people think. The browner one of these 2 lower jaws is from a species called Equus scotti in northern Canada. The other one, a bit more pristine, is a modern domestic horse. Yes, if you look very closely, you will see differences in the little squiggles of enamel, size of some of the teeth, things of that nature. But if this were any other megaherbivore that I was looking at, it didn't have this whole history with oversplitting of taxonomy, I think I could convince any colleague that these are the same thing. Yet it has a different species name. And something like that seems, okay, Ross, so you've waxed on about this whole taxonomy business. Well, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because the BLM uses that argument, that there was a great diversity of horses at the end of the Pleistocene in North America, to claim that you can't call Equus caudalis, the domestic horse, by the same name as any of these, that it represents something else, that it's a different species. And once you've done that and gone the next step, which is to declare the domestic horse invasive, then you've effectively taken that species out of our fauna, out of our native fauna, and said it's something else. It's other. It's alien. It doesn't belong. It's like medfly, murder hornet, kudzu, you name it. All of these things that different constituencies here hate because you have to deal with them. They're introduced by us, almost always, and they cause problems, not only for us, but in many cases for other species as well. So it is important. Taxonomy, in this case, is actually very important. So I took it on myself to do something about that. I'm now just going to go through a set of facts. You've heard them all. We can do this very quickly. But it sets the stage for the next part of this talk. So here's some undisputed facts. Yes, family equity arose here 50-odd million years ago and has been here persistently since then, except for a few thousand years at the end of the Quaternary, when they were possibly not here. But you've got more than 50 million years of equid history in North America. The particular group that gave rise to Equus caballus, this is a group that we call caballine horses, first appeared in the record around 4.5 to 5 million years ago. No argument about that. No argument about how horses got around. They got around into South America when the Isthmus of Panama was formed about 3 million years ago. They got into Eurasia on several occasions over the Bering land bridge, which was up and down episodically over a very long period of time. And there seems to have been a time at the end of the Pleistocene, again around 11,000 years ago, when horses disappeared, along with a lot of other things that I mentioned before. You can see mammoths and mastodons and many other species represented here. All of these are that disappeared from the end of the Pleistocene in North America. The horse is ringed, and the horse was assumed to be part of that lost group, but we're going to come back to that point whether that's correct or not. It is also not argued that the horse underwent an enormous amount of change as a result of domestication. Because that's what we do. When we want something out of nature, we want to make it better, or bigger, or more nutritious, or larger canines, or something like that. It's a benefit to us. We select for it. That is artificial selection. And then finally, and this is the standard story, horses seem not to have been around in North America for some period of time. But then they were brought here, this new species, the modern horse, the domesticated horse, was brought by Europeans beginning some 500 years ago. And here is now the point, as I've already said, the BLM takes that apparent fact and converts it into something else. But what was brought back was not the same thing as the kinds of horses, caballine horses that lived in North America. Those all disappeared. By virtue of domestication, that lineage became Equus caballus, the domestic horse, a different thing, an invasive species in this case. Well, we don't have to accept that without scientific scrutiny, and that's what our research program has been for the last several years, now with support from the Canna Foundation. I'm going to now briefly tell you about some of our most important results. But here is the story now that Amanda wanted me to tell you about the BLM website, which has what they call myths. They have a collection of stories, factoids about horses and about how the BLM treats horses in an effort to say we do it according to the highest standards, we do it according to the law, everything we do is above reproach. So here's one of them. So when I first started researching this was about more than 10 years ago now. You see there was a couple of paragraphs. I'm not going to read this, but it brings out the big thing. Wild horses not native to the United States for the reasons we've already gone into. Yes, these domestic horses that were brought here 500 years ago, they're pretty good. They were able to adapt to the West in particular, but that says nothing about their actual evolutionary ancestry because they're now different, very different species. They didn't evolve on the North American continent. And for that reason, they can't be considered native in any historical sense. J. Kirkpatrick, the late J. Kirkpatrick, was a vet who was in fact involved with the development of PCP and came to the same kinds of conclusions that I did from his own background and concluded that horses are really horses. If they're at any time within the last million years or so, they represent the same lineage of cavalry horses. And that consequently, the BLM has got it wrong. When we're talking about nativeness, we're looking at two things, as indicated here. Obviously, if you're native to a place, you have to have originated there in some sense. And Jay made a very important point that if you're part of that fauna in this case, you've got to have co-evolved with it, meaning that you were there a long time. You're a belonger. And as Amanda was talking about with respect to keystone species, in addition to living your life, you're also making life possible for other species who depend on you in some fashion for food, for making opportunities for things of that nature. So I don't have to say much more about this. Horses were part of the landscape all through the Quaternary period, as suggested here. This is the painting that Helmer did for the Canada website, showing a horse, the foal in this case, along with all of the interactions that horses are involved with the ecosystem all around it. So the burrowing owl is there, but there's horses you can see, I hope in the slide, if I didn't chop it off up here somewhere. Horses digging for water in this particular landscape, making it possible there for water to be available for animals that could not possibly dig themselves. Their carrion returns to the soil, their feces return to the soil, and in that way ensure that in this dynamic kind of ecosystem situation that conditions continue. And when you remove all of the big herbivores, you are spelling doom for lots of native species, for the microbiome that evolved in the context of that particular ecosystem, because if there's no inputs that they can use, what are they going to do? They're going to disappear. So you end up in a depauperate situation with fewer species than should have been there when you take out the keystones. Right, so in 2017, you can see that the text is getting a little bit longer because people like me are now raising objections to this idea that there's no possibility of nativeness. In fact, here they weasel out of it by saying, you remember back in 2011 it was, no, they're not native. Now it's, well, we don't really know it, and we don't really care because BLM is not about evolutionary biology, it's about administering the regulations in the Act. All right. So let's go back to the taxonomic question for a second. So what are species? Well, there's a very funny line that a very famous paleontologist came up with a number of years ago. It said, well, if you have a dozen biologists in the room, there will be at least 13 species concepts. And what he meant by that was that there's all of these ideas that are trying to box nature up in various kinds of ways, because that's what taxonomy is, trying to box up things in a way that makes some sort of cohesive sense. The trouble is, there is no one way of doing that. And that's not because of defects in thinking on the parts of biologists, it's because life is so bloody variable. a species of virus, if there is such a thing, is not going to be the same as a species of mammal, because all of its dynamics in a biological sense are utterly different. But we do have some standards, don't we? I mean, just common sense standards. If you're a member of the same species, then you are expecting the different genders to coalesce in such a way that they can produce viable, fertile offspring. That's the biological species concept, one of the most important of these concepts. And the idea here is that this is a very practical way of determining species boundaries. If it's not possible to produce viable, fertile offspring, then you've got something else. You don't have a single species, you may have multiple, at least one more. But that's often not enough, because particularly in the paleontological record, you can't tell who's breeding with whom. All you can do is look at physical remains and hope that if there's a sufficient amount of physical similarity, you can use that as a proxy. And on that basis, make an argument for species. So when we think about it, again, when you're looking at nature now, one of the ways in which, for common sense purposes, it's easy to distinguish species in nature is because there tend to be fairly large boundaries, morphological, among them, as you can see with these cats. They all come from a single ancestor, but they've diversified, and the intermediates that may have existed at one time or another have all disappeared, so they stand out in kind of sharp relief. They're silent, in a sense. But to go back to my original point, that's not the only part of the picture, because the other part of the picture is inherent variability, which natural selection requires in order to ensure continuity of species, so that different populations, if circumstances change, have resilience, so that they're able to persist over time. And what that means, and this is another important point, is that for any species, any natural species, there's going to be a slow change genetically over time because you're being selected for different populations making up that species. Will diverge in different ways and will eventually become species on their own. That's the cycle. We know that is the cycle. So variability is to be expected. It's not enough to say that if something doesn't look exactly like this thing, then it has to be a different species. Okay. Now, let's ask a very practical question. As you can see here, these two dogs are out on a date. What do you think is going to happen? Not very much, probably. But we would never say, because we know dogs as dogs, we know their history, we know that they're the result of enormous intervention in their genomes in order to produce different breeds, like the ones you see here. And as a result of that, probably in some circumstances, this relationship isn't going to go anywhere. From a breeding point of view, they're too different. But genetically, they're going to be extremely similar, except for the ways that interfere with the possibility of reproduction.
What way is that?
If
you.
Okay, and you can figure it out now. Here's the same thing. That's a Belgian that you see in the background and a Shetland pony, both bred by humans but for different purposes. One for haulage, and the other to work in mines, or wherever you needed a very small horse. Now, of course, a pet kind of horse. The Shetlands were originally used in coal mining. Are they different species because they look different? No, they're not. And it doesn't take much information to know that that is not the case, that they are, in fact, both horses are very divergent morphologically because of human intervention, once again. So let's come down to the big question. The kinds of morphological diversity that we see in the Quaternary record of North America, is it sufficient to say that there were dozens of species of horses living all at the same time, in fact, even in the same localities? And the answer to me is no. that that does not make sense from a biological point of view. And what the genomics revolution has actually demonstrated is what I just said is absolutely the case. What we now have is ancient DNA evidence from a whole variety of fossils, some of which were regarded as being all of these different species. And they're all the same. They're all the same in the way that we measure these things in terms of sufficient genetic sameness to classify them as the same species. But yes, they vary. But the response to that is, so what? All species do. It's not a reason to claim that they're not part of the same species, especially when you have an ulterior motive, as BLM does, to ensure that domestic horse be regarded as not the same as its ancestors that lived on this continent. Okay. Now, we've talked about DNA, and thanks to the movie, I'm not going to go over some of these points because we don't need to. But just for your own interest, to say a few words about the history of horses and the Bering land bridge, which is a very important part of their history, and why we have the situation today where horses are continually present in the record for Eurasia, but there's a blip, a time when horses were apparently not here in the latter part of the Quaternary. So the Bering land bridge, which you see in the cartoons over on the left-hand side of the slide here, there was an enormous grassland formation called the Mammoth Steppe that existed in the Quaternary, all across the northern part of Eurasia and into places like Alaska and Yukon. I'm going to say a word about that because rewilding, what we're talking about with respect to rewilding, is like a very light reflection, if we're able to do it at any kind of scale, of what existed under natural circumstances 100,000 years ago. The Mammoth Steppe was a very rich grassland because it was occupied by millions of large herbivores. Horses, mammoths, elk, reindeer, rhino. There was a great variety of big mammals that lived there in great abundance. And because they are factories for turning vegetable matter into ultimately feces, apart from feeding themselves, what you've got is a turnover mechanism that ensures that the more you consume, the more nutrients get returned to the soil, which, if the precipitation is favorable, is going to result in yet further highly productive grasslands, which is what existed there. That system collapsed around 11,000 years ago, for reasons that I'm not going to go into, but it did collapse. Along with that, a lot of the big herbivores disappeared, some completely, others had to migrate to more salubrious places in the central part of this country, for example, or equivalents in Eurasia. The land bridge was not continually up, it was inundated from time to time, but it was up for a long period of time. And what that permitted, as I've already said, is the opportunity for horses to move back and forth. This diagram is a little complicated, so I want to just say what it's going to show you in words. One of the ideas that came to me would be, with ancient DNA, if there is in fact a genetic connection between horses that lived in North America and those that lived in Eurasia, you should be able to demonstrate that. There should be markers as a result of natural evolution selecting for different genetic combinations that become frequent within individual populations. If you can show that, and it continues over time, then the argument would be there had to be some form of biological continuity between the populations. So what does that mean? Well, before ancient DNA came along, what paleontologists largely assumed was that the early ancestors of what became Asiatic horses got there in one fell swoop a million years ago, and that was about it. because you can't show with ordinary fossils anything more than that. They look similar, okay, so they got over there, but we don't know whether it was a traffic back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But you can show that with genomics. And in this particular study, which came out of Santa Cruz and kind of helped with its funding, it was found that there was repeated instances over time of markers showing up on opposite sides of the Bering Strait in different paleontological populations. So what we did was get a lot of horse fossils from northern Russia and China, and a lot of horse fossils from North America. We analyzed them, and what we found was the following: that a fairly low frequency, but nevertheless a frequency, you got markers distinctive of North American populations showing up in Asia, and you also got the reverse, markers that had developed in the Asian side after the split, the first population of Asia by cavalline horses, showing up in Alaska, Yukon, and in the central part of this country. There is no other way of explaining this than there had to have been a backing and forthing across the land bridge. That was the only available means for them to do that. So there were several points in time suggested by the yellow arrows. It was not high frequency, I want to emphasize that, but it was not negligible. 1 to 4% is a fairly high rate of hybridization, as we call it. And it extended up until the last part of the Pleistocene while the land bridge was still in existence. So there was biological continuity over long periods of time between cavalline horses in North America, those living in Asia. Now, is that enough to make the argument that they should be regarded as the same species? Well, I have to say yes and no. To scientists, that 1 to 4% hybridization rate sounds pretty good if you're talking about biological continuity. But if you're talking about, your bank account, 1% ain't too great, 4% is better, but it's not brilliant, right? So what are we saying? What we're saying is that for most people, they're prepared to believe that there was continuity in the sense of populations moving back and forth, or individuals moving back and forth across the Bering Land Bridge. But substantively, you still had the issue of horses disappearing and being, according to BLM, introduced first time as a new species by the Europeans. So we needed to do a different kind of work as well. Tyler Murchie's work was introduced to you. I know this is a forbidding looking chart. We're not going to go into it in detail. You can see that there's a horse icon, and that's what we're going to immediately look at. Here's how this investigation worked. What Tyler had was access to cores in permafrost soils that were taken for completely different reasons, geological reasons. A core is just a sediment package that you get by drilling down, just like you do for oil and gas, right? You have to go down to where the deposit is. And the core is all of the rock material that gets extracted out before you can shut down the pipe and get your oil and gas. In this case, you're not after oil and gas, you're after the actual rock, or in this case, unconsolidated sediments. And what they did, what Tyler did, was to, using modern genomic techniques, get evidence in terms of bits of genetic material that he was able to assign to different species. Now, this sounds like mumbo jumbo, I know, but it works in the following way. As humans, we all have distinctive parts of our genetic inheritance that mark us as humans. And there's a lot of it, and if you find little bits of it, you can still say a human was here. This is done in archaeology all the time now. This is human DNA representing somebody who lived here 10,000 years ago. Well, you can do that for any living thing, anything that is based on genes, if you have the genetic material in the soil. The trouble is that it's not intact. It's broken up into very small bits because the DNA molecule is fragile. But if you take these small bits and you, using modern bioinformatics or methods of interpreting them, you can tile them one on another and get long strings of sequence to ensure that the identifications you're making are well corroborated by the evidence. And that's what Tyler did. On that basis, he was able to identify dozens of species of birds from these cores covering parts of the last 40,000 years, hundreds of plant species, and among them was horse. These colors represent the different sites where the cores were taken. The numbers indicate how many separate hits within a sample he got of a given species, and the rest of the chart looks exactly the same regarding proportion of hits relative to the samples being taken. So you can see all along here, this is 40,000 up at this end, this is 11,000 here, right at the end of the Pleistocene again, and you can see that something fairly dramatic happens. Right at the end of the Pleistocene, the number of hits in all of the cores diminishes, but it doesn't go to zero. This was the fascinating thing. The expectation was that because, like all of these other big herbivores I mentioned earlier, the notion was that they should have all disappeared at roughly the same time 11,000 years ago. But you had hits, not big hits, but not trivial hits. This last one at 60,000, 30 hits in that particular sample, is comparable to other places in the sampling stream where the number of hits was low. The interpretation would be, in fact, that horses were not frequent at this time. It's very hard to go from this kind of data to any kind of population estimate, although Tyler tried. But for our purpose, right now, the interesting thing is there was any form of continuity after the supposed extinction date around 11,000 years ago. Here is Tyler's effort to use these kinds of data in order to say something about population. Again, without going into the technicalities, you're seeing species that will be familiar to you, like woolly mammoth, buffalo, reindeer, caribou, pheasant. These are among the species that he recovered, and the color coding is for different kinds of animals that are represented in this chart. So just a common sense reading is, okay, so there was a time around 14,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, when it was real good for elephants. There's a lot of them on the landscape, but then there was fluctuation, as also happens all the time in natural systems. Buffalo were also at roughly the same time doing very well, but then they suffered relative diminution of apparent population size. And then right at 11,000, the records collapse more, so that there's only sort of a thin stream left indicating that there was continuity of these populations into the most recent period, one that we're living in now. But horses are there, and this is the point. Whoops. Yes, in yellow. You can barely see it, but there is a very thin band suggesting continuity. Now notice that the same thing happened to bison. Our notion of bison, because our sense of the history of it is only as long as there's a written record, is that they were very dominant on the plains in the last few hundred years, and then due to overhunting collapsed. Well, overhunting is probably not the explanation here, and instead, for other reasons which are hard to specify but nevertheless occurred, bison came down to nearly nothing, but then recovered. This is the way it really works in the real world. It's not always a question that a species has to confront some bad news and disappears, like when the big impactor that took out the dinosaurs hit the planet 66 million years ago. It's rarely like that. Most of what happens is the different populations persist for relatively long periods of time, and then when conditions change, only those populations that are best adapted to the new situation are the ones that are going to survive. And they may not survive very long, or in the alternative, they may do extremely well, like bison did here. Okay, so back to Jay just for a minute. We have evidence of origination. Horses began here, so you can tick that box off. The cable lines on that basis should be considered native. They also co-evolved with their habitat as grass eaters. Just like cows in that family of Ovidae, the adaptations they made all the way along ensured that formations like the mammoth steppe could form. These sort of self-driven, self-dynamic ecological situations, where it was the organisms themselves that ensured the continuity of the ecosystem. So for those reasons, you'd think that the BLM would have had an aha moment and said to themselves, well, I guess we were wrong. I had the opportunity to go back to when I was preparing these slides. The 2022 version of myth number 11. And now it's gone from a paragraph to a dissertation. And let's have a look at this part. I love this language. Although it may be interesting from a scientific perspective, which is to say, okay, you nerds, yes, you're getting off on this, but the evolutionary history of horses does not influence the BLM's wild horse management. Notice now, cable-line horses did evolve in North America. In 2011, no, but there's now a sea change. And nevertheless, and they had to put it in this fashion, they disappeared. But we've also heard that up in Yukon, horses might have survived a few thousand years more. But then that was it, and they were out of there too. So where are we still? And all of the credible evidence, namely the evidence that BLM accepts, points in one direction, which is that horses disappeared from North America. The ones that were brought over are not the same thing, whatever that means. And for that reason, they can be classified as invasive, and for that reason, they can be treated in the way that they are treated, as aliens. And it makes a huge difference. Eric and I have had correspondence on exactly this matter. You've got well-meaning, I suppose, rangeland experts who want to compare what horses do to rangelands versus what cattle do. And they begin with the assumption that it's an invasive species, so accordingly, anything it does is wrong, destructive, harmful to the environment. The cows get a bite because they're also invasive. There's money connected with them because you can slaughter them.
Ross, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you talk about that statement in that which says that they're not native because they're descendants of domesticated horses? Because that speaks to the questions today, right? Domesticated versus wild.
There is a certain constituency that believes that as a result of domestication, you should classify that organism by a different name. You should give it a different species name. These are biologists I'm talking about, not BLM. But they're doing that for practical reasons. What they're saying is that there's part of the world where humans have not influenced breeding and selection and so forth. That's what we want to study. And then there's the part of the natural world that has been so influenced. And they're a category that should be taken out because the reason why they look like they do, and they have the genes that they do, the frequencies they do, is because of artificial selection. But that's not germane to this argument. That has nothing to do with the actual evolutionary biology involved here. Just like we saw with those dogs. They were wolves. In fact, if you want to put it in this context, mammalogists no longer use the species name Canis familiaris, which is a name you may have learned for domestic dogs, because they're so similar to wolves. And coyotes are so similar to both of those species, and golden jackals for that matter, that they're all the same thing, or nearly so. So the proper name now for your dog, whether it's a Chihuahua or the ones that Amanda has or anybody else, they're all Canis lupus, because that's the original first name for the wolf, and that's what they are. Yes, changed. Yes, you'd never confuse them with a wolf. But biologically, taxonomically, phylogenetically, that's what they are. And that's where we should be coming from with regard to the question of what horses are. It doesn't matter whether they were domesticated, as J. Kirkpatrick said years ago. It has nothing to do with what we're looking at in respect of their actual evolutionary history. The fact that they're artificially selected, fine. That has other importance, that kind of thing, but it does not relate to origins. So I'm going to end now, because the sister group for BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, actually has a definition for native species. Isn't that interesting? With respect to a particular ecosystem, a species, other than as a result of an introduction, historically occurred or currently occurs in that ecosystem, is a native. Now, there's interesting tweaks in this language. Why are we saying historically? Well, you can't have history unless it's written. And you don't have written history unless you're a white person. So it can't possibly be older than a few hundred to a few thousand years. This particular definition would apply. Biologically, that's nonsense. So I suggest something different, admittedly more complicated, but it's trying to grapple with the idea that you want multiple lines of evidence to support your conclusion. So a native species is an extant species, that's first of all important, on the basis of combinations of different kinds of evidence. Now, I've listed some here, the kinds of evidence that I've been talking about today. There might be others as well, including oral tradition kinds of evidence. It all depends on what you're trying to show and what the audience is. But the important thing is that they originated and they flourished in a specific place. And that place is their home. And that's where they belong. And that's what they're part of. And for all those reasons, that is what Equus caballus is. It is part of our native fauna on multiple scientifically justifiable grounds. There, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Can I just ask one more?